So there's this guy named Heinz, and his wife is very sick. She needs a drug to live, but the drug is expensive, and the only way to get the drug is through a very greedy druggist who is charging so much for it that Heinz can't possibly afford it. The druggist refuses to make an exception for Heinz and lower the price, so Heinz, in an act of desperation, steals the drug. Now you, participant in my study, are posed with the question, should Heinz have stolen the drug? But more importantly, you are asked the question of your reasoning for your answer. So it's not just should Heinz have stolen the drug, but why do you think Heinz should have stolen the drug or not? Suppose your answer is yes, that Heinz should have stolen it. Your reasoning tells us what level of moral development you are operating at. So if you say he should have stolen the drug because life is more important than property, then you're operating at a pretty high level of moral reasoning because you're invoking principles of basic human rights to life. If, however, you say that he should have stolen the drug because his wife and family will be eternally grateful to him, well, you're not doing so well on the advancement of your moral development. You're operating at a lower level because you're basing your reasoning on relationships with others as opposed to transcending them to invoke principles of universal human rights. So that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Except that this research conducted by Lawrence Kohlberg was done exclusively with boys. Kohlberg took the result of his research on boys and declared that he had unlocked a critical understanding of human moral reasoning that applies to everyone, males and females. Carol Gilligan came along and said, wait a minute, you haven't even asked girls the question. None of this research is informed by a female perspective. What Carol learned is that girls approach problems like these faced by Heinz in a different way from boys, in a different voice, if you will. Boys would answer the question, should Heinz have stolen the drug, because boys are programmed to answer questions that they are asked. Girls would if asked the question, should Heinz have stolen the drug, if they were asked that, if you would give them the opportunity to tell you their answer, they would say, what the heck are you talking about? You're not even asking the right question. This problem isn't about Heinz. This problem is about the druggist. You need to ask what's going on between Heinz and the druggist that's preventing a solution from happening here. Unfortunately, girls aren't given the opportunity to tell you that. Because the methodology used to test this moral reasoning didn't allow for this kind of thinking outside the box. You could only answer the questions that were asked of you. If you tried to answer this question in a way that would reflect these kinds of relationships, well, then you'd be shown to be operating at a lower level of moral reasoning. So girls lost out. But I think more importantly, we all lost out on understanding the importance of relationships to those around us when making our moral judgments. And so Carol wrote in a different voice, to take into consideration an understanding of ethics that include relationships. And she used this approach to help us understand the decision-making behind one of the most divisive issues in the United States, that of abortion. To say that the book had an influence on how people think about gender and psychology is a vast understatement. The book itself currently has over 30,000 citations on Google Scholar. And to put that into some context, that is 3 times the citations on Google Scholar than Crick and Watson's Nobel Prize-winning work on the structure of DNA, and over 10 times as many citations as the research that revealed holes in the ozone layer. But Carol is totally unimpressed by these kinds of statistics. You would never guess if you met her that she's the author of one of the most influential books ever written about gender. You would never guess that Time magazine once named her one of the 25 most influential American thinkers. You would never know this about Carol because she's one of the warmest, humble, and human people that you will ever meet. Carol's work today continues her methodology and continues to transform how people think about morality and ethics. She has changed the lives of innumerable people through her work, and I'm sure she's changing the lives of the students here at NYU Abu Dhabi, who are the lucky ones to be taking her classes. Indeed, we're all the lucky ones to have her here in Abu Dhabi, not just for today and for this talk, but for the entire semester. So thank you, Carol. Please join me in welcoming Carol.
I want to thank Nils Lewis and the Institute for inviting me to give this talk. I want to thank P.J. Henry for that really, most to me, moving introduction. Generous, moving introduction. And also to say that our friendship has been one of the great pleasures for me in being here at NYU Abu Dhabi. And I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Teaching at this global, help! Teaching at this global university is a deeply difficult experience. And it's been long enough now, just long enough, that it has come to feel ordinary to have students from all over the world. In my Women's Voices class, 12 different countries are represented, and that's without counting that some students have grown up in more than one country. For example, Taiwan and New Zealand, or Ecuador and Hungary. And we read together and we discuss the kinds of issues writers write about. Love, passion, anger, violence, families, growing up, loyalty and betrayal, human problems. Last week, we read Arundhati Roy's novel, The God of Small Things. And when I asked the students what passage had gripped them, one took us to the heart of the book. The passage is about history and how it claims us, how what Roy calls, quote, the history house comes to be where we, quote, really live. In the scene, Amu, the name means mother, watches Rahel, her 7-year-old daughter, lifted by Lulutha, a carpenter from a family of untouchables who had taken from his childhood his smile. One of the things we found most striking in our reading of women writers this term has been their richly detailed and sensual evocation of the natural world. We saw it in Layla Ahmed's description of her childhood in Cairo, in Jamaica Kincaid's account of her childhood in Antigua, and perhaps nowhere more striking than in Roy's description of Kerala, where the twins Rahel and Esther grow up, where her story is set. Because in all of these books, there's a sense of something elusive, something forgotten that needs to be recalled, that needs to be called back into memory, and also a sense of surprise in coming upon what is, after all, natural, or, as Wallace Stevens would say, part of nature, part of us. I quote from the novel. Amu was surprised at the extent of her daughter's physical ease with Lulutha, surprised that her child seemed to have a subworld that excluded her entirely, a tactile world of smiles and laughter that she, her mother, had no part in. Amu recognized vaguely that her thoughts were shot with a delicate purple tinge of envy. She didn't allow herself to consider whom it was that she envied, the man or her child, or just their world of hooked fingers and sudden smiles. The man standing in the shade of the rubber trees, with coins of sunshine dancing on his body, holding her daughter in his arms, glanced up and caught Amu's gaze. Centuries telescoped into one evanescent moment. History was wrong-footed, caught off guard, sloughed off like an old snakeskin, its marks, its scars, its wounds from old wars and the walking backward days all fell away. In its absence, it left an aura, a palpable shimmering that was as plain to see as the water in a river or the sun in the sky, as plain to feel as the heat on a hot day or the tug of a fish on a taut line. So obvious that no one noticed. In the midst of a decaying world, a world shot through with personal grievance and political unrest, we are taken into this shimmering, evanescent moment where history is caught off guard, and what happens? Quote, as plain to see as the water in a river, as plain to feel as the heat on a hot day, so obvious that no one noticed. was a tactile world took over, a world of hooked fingers and sudden smiles. Amu watched it happen between Rahel and Belutha as he lifted her effortlessly and tossed her in the air. On her daughter's face, she saw, quote, the high delight of the airborne young. And then we see it happen between Amu and Belutha, a luminous woman and a luminous man who in this moment see each other. Quote, Belutha saw that Rahel's mother was a woman. This knowing slid into him. Amu saw that he saw. She looked away. He did too. And here's the passage that gripped my student. Quote, history's fiends return to claim them, to rewrap them in its old scarred pelt and drag them back to where they really lived, where the love laws lay down who should be loved and how much. My talk tonight is about this tension between where we live and where we, quote, really live, between a tactile world of hooked fingers and sudden smiles, of seeing and knowing, and what we generally think of as knowledge, between psychology and history, between love and the love laws. My title, Betraying Empathy, was suggested to me by Niels Lewis. And it wasn't until he mentioned it that I remembered that betraying has two meanings. The usual meaning, breaking trust, turning one's back on, being disloyal to, abandoning. But there is a second meaning, revealing, bringing out into the open something that was hidden. One reason the women writers we've read this term go to such lengths to evoke the natural world in all its sensual reality is that they are seeking to recall something that had been covered over, how it was then. In Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, the narrator, thinking back into her childhood and remembering the year when she was 9, asks, but was it really like that? As painful as I remember. And then she goes on to recall what it was that she had forgotten. Love, thick and dark as a laga syrup, eased up into that cracked window. I could smell it, taste it, sweet, musty, with an edge of wintergreen in its base, everywhere in that house. It stuck along with my tongue to the frosted window panes. It coated my chest along with the salve. And when the flannel came undone in my sleep, the clear, sharp curves of air outlined its presence on my throat. And in the night, when my coughing was dry and tough, feet padded into the room. Hands repinned the flannel, readjusted the quilt, and rested a moment on my forehead. So when I think of autumn, I think of somebody with hands who does not want me to die. Someone with hands, the carpenter who lifts Rahel into the air, the mother who pins the flannel, the luminous woman who touches a luminous man, the untouchable man who touches a touchable woman. The last chapter of Roy's novel is called, quote, The Cost of Living. If you follow psychological development, as I do, and chart how over time we grow psychologically, you will come to this moment when something that is part of our nature as humans comes up against a history that we have created. It's the moment I find riveting, the turning point in the plot, the place where the story opens, where it could go either way, where history grips us and we can ask whether and how we can resist it, and also how and why and when we take this history into ourselves and repeat it. Two themes will be central in my talk. First, the intersections where psychology and history collide. And second, how we come to rewrite our personal stories, our life histories, so that they conform with history, and in doing so end up telling what within ourselves we know to be a false story. And then how we come not to know this. Let me go back to my title. Once you reveal empathy for what it is, a basic human capacity, you see that it is in our nature to feel the human world around us. To know now, we know now, that we have mirror neurons, that in our bodies we pick up what others are feeling. In the feeling of what happens, the neurobiologist Antonio Damasio's book on the development of consciousness, he describes how, in our bodies and in our emotions, we register our experience from moment to moment, like a film running continually inside us, and also our experience of watching the film, which gives rise to what he calls core consciousness, or a core sense of self, grounded in the body and in emotion. In our bodies and our emotions, we pick up the music or the feeling of what happens, which then plays in our minds and thoughts. Think about it for a moment. What this means is that if you don't want to know what you know in your gut, what you register in your body and your emotions, then you separate your mind from your body and your thoughts from your emotions. To the extent that we have built these separations of mind from body and thought from emotion into our educational system, we are preparing students to rely not on the voice of experience, but on the voice of authority. We'll come back to this when we listen to 13-year-old Judy. But for now, once empathy, our ability to pick up the feelings of others, to feel the experience of others, to register our own experience, to feel with others and with ourselves, once empathy is revealed, we see how it gives us access to a kind of knowing, not generally considered knowledge, and also grounds our capacity to care, not in abstract moral precepts, but in the grittiness of our daily existence, like the mother with hands who does not want her child to die. Once empathy is revealed as part of our nature, the question becomes, how do we come to betray this part of ourselves? To not know, to not feel, to not see, to not live. I came to an insight recently that had the feeling of epiphany, of sudden realization. It had been years since I'd written about moral development. Years, actually, since I thought about Heinz and his dilemma. Following in a different voice, my attention had turned to charting girls' development, to connecting women's psychology with its history in girls' development rather than comparing women with men. And the research with girls then led me to initiate a study with 4- and 5-year-old boys, to work with couples who had reached a point of impasse in their relationship, to ask why are we drawn to tragic love stories and why do we repeat them? And as you can see by this time, I'm very far from academic discussions about right and wrong. So I was startled when I went to a lecture given by a psychiatrist friend of my husband, and the word moral suddenly came back with the force of radical illumination. The psychiatrist was Jonathan Shay, and he was talking about moral injury. Let me introduce you to his work. Although some of you may know his book, Achilles in Vietnam, where he writes about his experience as a psychiatrist working with Vietnam combat veterans who were suffering from severe and chronic post-traumatic stress disorders. Listening to the veterans, Shay recognized a shattering of trust that had followed the betrayal of what's right in a high-stakes situation where the betrayal was sanctioned by someone in a position of legitimate authority, where others had seen post-traumatic stress disorder, Shay saw post-traumatic stress injury, saw it more specifically as a moral injury, a shattering of trust that followed the betrayal of what's right. Here's one of the veterans, a member of a long-range reconnaissance patrol that was led by an intelligence error to kill innocent civilians. As the veteran said, quote, a lot of fishermen and kids. Shay asks us to listen to this veteran, to listen in a way that the students in my class on listening find challenging, as I also do, because it goes against the grain of what we've been rewarded for doing, that is, knowing what things mean. Shay asks us to suspend that chatter in our heads. He says so before analyzing, before classifying, before thinking, before trying to do anything, we should listen. Here's what the veteran, the member of the platoon that had killed innocent civilians, says. What got us thoroughly confused is at that time you turn to the team and you say to the team, don't worry about it. Everything's fine, because that's what you're told from upstairs. The colonel says, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. You know, we got body count. We have body count. So it starts working on your head. So you know in your heart it's wrong. But at the same time, here's your superiors telling you it's okay. So I mean, that's okay, right? This is part of war. They wanted to give us a unit citation, which is the highest combat medal. A lot of medals came down from it. The lieutenant got medals, and I know the colonel got his medal. And they would have award ceremonies, you know. I'd be standing like a jerk, and they'd be handing out medals for killing civilians. Just listen, the veterans say when telling mental health professionals what they need to know to work with them. Meaning, take in the story before trying to make sense of it. Because in fact, the stories don't make sense. They're stories about becoming, quote, confused, where the confusion starts, quote, working on your head. Because, quote, you know in your heart it's wrong, and you're told by your superiors it's okay. And it's not just okay, but rewarded with medals of honor. In the words of one veteran, these stories are, quote, sacred stuff. All too often, as Shay notes, our mode of listening deteriorates into intellectual sorting, with the professional grabbing the veteran's words from the air and sticking them into mental bins. We assume we know what we're hearing, that we don't really have to listen, that we've heard it all before. Thus, in Shay's words, we resemble museum goers whose whole experience consists of mentally saying, that's Cubist, that's El Greco, and who never see anything they've looked at. As Shay observes, this form of listening destroys trust. Shay's observations about listening were familiar to me. It's the approach I've taken in my research. Listening in a way that creates trust was essential to hearing a, quote, different voice, meaning a voice that did not make sense according to the prevailing categories of interpretation, because it challenged the framework. The method of listening was so crucial to the process of discovery that in the mid-1980s, my graduate students and I set out to render it systematic by creating a listening guide that other researchers could follow. But I was startled by Shay's description of moral injury, because it caught up a series of observations I'd made in the course of charting development, caught them up and gave them a name, moral injury. I too had observed a shattering of trust. It had followed an experience of betrayal in a situation where the stakes were high and the betrayal was culturally sanctioned. I had witnessed girls in adolescence and boys at 4 and 5 undergoing a process of initiation that bore some of the hallmarks of trauma, a loss of voice and a loss of memory. Listening to Shay, I suddenly made the connection that trauma was a moral trauma. The initiation, often mistaken for development, had left an injury or a scar, and what was injured were children's moral capacities, their capacity for empathy, their ability to read the human world around them, to pick up and register the feeling of what happens, to say what they see, to connect knowing with feeling, to live in their bodies, to trust what they know in their hearts. I was not witnessing trauma of the extremity that Shay had described. I was observing, interviewing, running writing and theater clubs with children and adolescents, listening, interacting with girls and women, with young boys and their fathers. And what I saw was a betrayal of relationship, a betrayal of love, if you will, that was culturally sanctioned and socially enforced. Losses that were seen as necessary or inevitable, part of becoming civilized or growing up. Speaking of what's right, Shay notes that, quote, no single English word takes in the whole sweep of a culture's definition of right and wrong. We use terms such as moral order, convention, normative expectations, ethics, and commonly understood social values. The ancient Greek word themis that Homer used encompasses all these meanings. What's right is Shay's equivalent of themis. His colloquial phrasing captures the sense of an inner compass that we carry with us, which alerts us to when we've lost our way or are doing something we know in our hearts is wrong. My observation of something akin to moral injury was sparked by the studies of girls' development, and more specifically, by signs of resistance. My research team and I were working in public schools, private schools, girls' schools, co-ed schools, after-school programs, but the key study was one where we followed a group of over 100 girls between the ages of 7 and 17 for over a period of 5 years, through the time when they came of age, and this turned out to be a critical juncture because the research, the yearly interviews, and the more intensive observations and interactions with girls in after-school theater and writing programs caught the moment when a voice that had been outspoken receded into silence. The phrase, "I don't know," began peppering our interview transcripts, rising sharply from year to year and serving, as we discovered, less as an admission of ignorance than as a cover for knowing. With adolescence, the word "don't" came to stand between I and know. The complementary phrase, which at first seemed an irritating tick, was, "you know." You hear it if you listen to adolescent girls. You know, you know, you know. But in the context of our interviews, it sounded more like a question posed by girls to the women who were interviewing them. Do you know? What do you know? Will you say what you know about being a woman in the world? The studies of development, the straightforward charting of girls' psychological growth or maturation, thus illuminated a crossroads in girls' lives at adolescence, where an inner compass pointed in one direction and the highway signs pointed in another. Girls had to throw away or ignore their compasses in order to follow the prescribed route with conviction. In their reluctance to do so, my colleagues and I saw evidence of a resistance that was associated with psychological resiliency and strength, but this healthy resistance to losses that were psychologically costly became embattled because the girls were challenging ways of seeing and speaking that were historically sanctioned and culturally enshrined. The intersection of psychology and history was also marked by confusion, because at this juncture in development, the meaning of what's right was shifting. The right way to go was not the right way to go. And in this sense, the research goes beyond Shay to suggest what in fact the veteran had implied, namely, it's not just the themis, the whole sweep of a culture's definition of right and wrong. It's what in our hearts we know. And it was this clash between a heart knowing and a history of knowledge, this collision of inner and outer worlds, where one needed to stay in touch with both that imbued this moment in development with a sense of crisis, a turning point for better or worse, and also a site of moral injury or trauma. But let me be more specific, because the girls were very precise in describing the impasse they faced as a crisis of connection. What had seemed ordinary, having a voice, living in relationships, suddenly became extraordinary, requiring an act of what seemed like moral courage. Here's Iris, a 17-year-old, the valedictorian of her high school class. She and I have been talking about the younger girls in the study, how outspoken they are, their frank and fearless voices. Iris says, if I were to say what I was feeling and thinking, no one would want to be with me. My voice would be too loud. And then she adds, by way of explanation, but you have to have relationships. I agree. But, I say, if you are not saying what you're feeling and thinking, then where are you in these relationships? Iris sees the paradox in what she's saying. She has given up relationship in order to have, quote, relationships, muting her voice so that, quote, she could be with other people. The interesting thing is I had no trouble following what she was saying, and yet it was psychologically incoherent. To say what she was feeling and thinking would jeopardize her relationships, but not saying what she was feeling and thinking meant she was not present in these so-called relationships. Either way, she would lose connection. And the fact is, she saw it. And she was not alone. Other girls described it as well. In this light, it became clear that what previously had been described, what many psychologists still describe as girls' problems with separation, is more accurately seen as a crisis in development precipitated by what some girls recognized as a false choice. That is, a choice between having a voice and having relationships. This choice played out endlessly in the research I wrote about in A Different Voice. The studies with women who were facing moral conflict in choice, who basically were asking, should I be selfless, without a voice or desires of my own, or should I be selfish, deaf to the needs of others, unconcerned about relationships? This is how the world looks following the crisis of connection. You can have a voice, or you can have relationships. The reality is that without a voice or some way of communicating your experience, there is no relationship, only the chimera of relationship. And in the absence of relationship or resonance, voice recedes into silence or takes on the sound of someone speaking in an echo chamber. We have come to the gender binary, the division of human experience, of human capacities into, quote, masculine or, quote, feminine. You can all do this. What gender is reason? Is reason masculine or feminine? It's masculine. What about self? Masculine. What about mind? Masculine. What about emotions? Feminine. See? Relationships? Feminine. You see where this is heading. Toward gender stereotypes so inane that the only surprising thing is that we repeat them. Men think, women feel. Men have selves, women have relationships. Men want justice, women don't want rights. Women care, men don't care about relationships. The gender binary and the gender hierarchy, the splitting of human capacities into masculine or feminine, and the privileging of those gendered masculine are the DNA of patriarchy, the building blocks of a patriarchal order. That is, a hierarchy based on age and gender that privileges the voice of fathers, the voices of fathers, and thus elevates some men over other men and all men over women. Here's Judy, age 13. It's adolescence, the time when girls are becoming young women, the time when they enter secondary education and learn how, quote, we see and speak, that is, what is the right way to see and speak, the one that gets the A. Judy is an 8th grader in a girls' school in Cleveland, Ohio, one of the girls in a 5-year study of girls' development that is going on at her school. In her interview at 13, Judy describes her experience of an initiation that to her carries with it the danger of losing her mind. Your mind, she explains, pointing to her gut, is associated with your heart and your soul and your internal feelings and your real feelings. Facing the quandary of how to stay in touch with what she knows in her gut, in her heart, and what is generally considered knowledge, Judy arrives at a creative solution. She separates her mind not from her body, but from her brain, which she locates in her head and associates with her smartness, her intelligence, her education. People, she says, quote, can control what they're teaching you and say this is right and this is wrong. That's connection, that's control like into your brain. But the feeling is just with you. The feeling can't be changed by someone else who wants it to be this way. It can't be changed by saying, no, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. But still, as Judy reflects, after a while, you just sort of forget your mind because everything is being shoved at you into your brain. Judy is 13, a reflective 8th grader, struggling with dissociation and trying to hold on to her embodied mind. She connects with a voice that carries moral authority, a voice she experiences as intrusive and controlling. You can forget your mind, she says, but the deeper sort of knowing, the knowing she associates with her heart and her soul and her real thoughts and feelings, can't be changed by someone saying, no, this is wrong, this is right. However forceful the initiation, however linked with smartness, intelligence, and education and all they imply, the, quote, feeling is just with you, a gut knowing, buried perhaps, but not lost. It is this knowing, not the intellectual knowing, that is repeatedly cited by people who took great risks in the face of real terror. One of the challenges to moral theory posed by the Holocaust is that intelligence and education prove no barriers to atrocity. When we listen to those who resisted, Magda Trocmé, the pastor's wife in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, who responded when Jews knocked at her door by saying, quote, come in. Antonia Zabinska, the zookeeper's wife in occupied Warsaw, who hid over 300 Jews in the zoo in the center of the city. And her husband Jan Zabinski, the zookeeper, who devised a ruse that enabled him to lead Jews out of the ghetto under the eyes of the Nazis. When asked how they did, what they say is that they were human. They did what any person would have done. Interviewed by the Israeli press after Antonia, Nina, and he were recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, Jan explained, quote, it wasn't an act of heroism, just a simple human obligation. What if we take him at his word? Then the questions about development reverse. Rather than asking, how do we gain the capacity to care? How do we learn to take the point of view of the other and overcome the pursuit of self-interest? We are prompted to ask instead, how do we lose the capacity to care? What inhibits our ability to empathize with others and read the human weather? How do we fail to recognize the difference between being in and out of touch? And most painfully, how do we lose the capacity to love? How do we come to betray our humanity? I want to show you a triptych of development. If I were a PowerPoint person, I would do it with slides. But just imagine 3 panels in front of you. I'm going to move from your right to left. That is, on the far right panel, you see teenage boys, high school age boys. In the center panel, you see girls entering adolescence, middle school girls. And on the left panel, you see boys at 4 and 5, moving from pre-kindergarten to kindergarten and into first grade. The triptych shows a process of initiation that begins with young boys, that continues with girls when they come of age, and then is reinforced among boys as they become men. I'll start there with the work of Niobe Way, a member of our faculty, my dear friend and colleague, formerly my graduate student at Harvard. The word betrayal occurs repeatedly in her book, Deep Secrets, used by the adolescent boys in her studies to explain why they no longer have a best friend, why they don't tell their secrets to anyone anymore. Justin describes it as something that, quote, just happens. He doesn't know if it's natural or whatever, but the shattering of trust is unmistakable. As Joseph says, quote, you can't trust nobody these days. Something had happened. Justin was among the majority of boys in Way's studies, boys from a range of cultural backgrounds, Latino, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Chinese, African American, Anglo, Muslim, Russian, Asian, who spoke about having and wanting intimate male friendships and then gradually losing these relationships and their trust in their male peers. For example, as a freshman and sophomore in high school, Mohammed spoke of telling his best friend all of his secrets. Yet when he was interviewed as a junior, he said, I don't know. Recently, I kind of changed something, not that much, but I feel like there's no need to. I could keep my feelings to myself. Fernando echoes, he says, I'm mature enough. Fernando echoes his sentiment. Asked what he sees as an ideal friendship, he begins, you gotta be funny, you gotta be truthful, I just gotta have fun with you, But then he says more haltingly and with a question, you gotta, I guess, just be there for me, I guess. I don't want to sound too sissy-like. I think I've matured in certain ways. I know how to be more of a man. In the early years of high school, the boys in Way's studies resist the gender binary that makes it sissy-like to depend on someone and want them to just be there for me. But by the end of high school, the binary has been internalized and enforced. Emotional intimacy and vulnerability have taken on a gender, girly, and a sexuality, gay. And being a man means being emotionally stoic and independent, not needing to tell your feelings to anyone, keeping them to yourself, not needing anyone to be there for you, being able to stand alone. It's not that the boys don't know the value of close friendships. They say it directly to Way and her research team. Without a best friend to tell your secrets to, you would go wacko, George says. Chen says that without a close friend to talk to, you go crazy. The research backs them up. Other boys speak about how anger builds up inside them when they don't have a best friend to talk to. Some speak of sadness, loneliness, and depression. Yet in spite of knowing what they know about the costs of not having close friendships, they minimize the loss and downplay its consequences, chalking up the loss to maturity or knowing how to be more of a man. It's as if they don't know what they know. The research with girls, the center panel of the triptych, shows the mechanism of betrayal. It's enacted through separations that create rifts in the psyche. The head is divided from the heart, the mind from the body, and the embodied voice, the voice that carries the feeling of what happens, is separated from relationships. On the surface, it's as though nothing has happened. The girls are doing well, some extremely well. At 16, Niti, an outstanding student and school leader, says, quote, the voice that stands up for what I believe in has been buried deep inside me. She's aware that she has silenced a voice of integrity, presumably for safekeeping. Its silence, however, compromises her relationships. She's aware of this too, and will limit her ability to participate as a citizen in a democratic society. Articulate girls such as Judy and Needy, there are many more examples if we have time, describe their strategies of resistance, separating your mind from your education, taking an honest voice underground. When it becomes seemingly impossible to have a voice and also to have relationships, some form of psychic splitting is inescapable. If a woman cannot know her own desires, she must leave her body. If she can't say what she's feeling and thinking, she must silence an honest voice. And with this dissociation of mind from body or thought from emotion or self from relationships, we begin not to know what we know. I don't know, the girls in my studies say. I don't care, the boys in Way's studies say. And yet the research shows that in fact, girls do know and boys do care, although they may need not to know what to show this. The internalization of the gender binary and hierarchy marks the psyche's induction into patriarchy. Patriarchy, a hierarchy based on gender and privileging the voices of fathers, is in tension with democracy, which rests on a premise of equal voice or equality. But it is also in conflict with human nature. By splitting human qualities into masculine or feminine, the gender binary forces dissociation, and the hierarchy undermines trust. Thus, the initiation entails a betrayal of what's right by shattering our ability to live with integrity in relationships with others. The stakes are high, identity and inclusion are on the line, and the betrayal is enforced by shaming and rewarded with the equivalent of medals of honor. Iris, who doesn't say what she's feeling and thinking, is, as I mentioned, the valedictorian of her high school class, and she has been admitted to the highly competitive college that is her first choice. To appreciate what is lost and why, one only has to listen to girls in the years before the initiation sets in. In a discussion of whether it's ever good to tell a lie, Elise, a 6th grader in an urban public school, says, quote, "My house is wallpapered with lies." I always think of her when people say, we want girls to have their voices, and I think, really? Elise's voice is the voice of countless pre-adolescent girls. It's a voice that has been heard across time and cultures. We know this voice, but we often don't register it, or we cover it in the way that girls themselves come to cover it by dismissing it as, quote, stupid or rude or simply too loud. Thus, it takes a certain effort to listen without rushing to judgment. At the beginning of Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's novel, Jane, age 10, tells her Aunt Reed, "You said I was a liar? I'm not. If I were a liar, I'd have said I loved you, and I don't." You see, people think you're good, but you are bad and hard-hearted. I will let everyone know what you have done. This is the voice of 10-year-old Wajda in the recent film from Saudi Arabia, of Iphigenia in Euripides' tragedy, of Miranda in The Tempest, of Claudia in The Bluest Eye, Rahel in The God of Small Things, Tambu in Tsitsi Dangaremba's coming-of-age novel Nervous Conditions, Annie John, the list is endless. We know this voice. If you hang around with 10 and 11-year-old girls, you will hear it. Yet it's hard not to hear it as girls themselves come to hear it as unpleasant and, quote, insufferable. The adjectives are Anne Frank's. The voice is culturally inflected but clearly recognizable. A girl on the threshold of becoming a young woman sees what she's facing and says what she sees. In Charlotte Bronte's novel, when Aunt Reed tells Jane that, quote, children must be corrected for their faults, Jane responds, "Deceit is not my fault." And that is precisely the issue. Honest and direct, girls' voices must be corrected or dismissed, otherwise what they say would have to be addressed. Yet once the correction is made, the voice recedes into silence. Few people ask, where is that honest voice? Millions of us read Anne Frank's diary, without realizing that what we were reading was not Anne's actual diary, but a version of the diary that Anne herself had edited. In March of 1944, she heard on Radio Free Orange, broadcasting from London into the Netherlands, that the Dutch government in exile was planning to establish a war museum after the war, and were interested in letters, diaries, and collections of sermons that would show how the Dutch people carried on their lives under the extreme conditions of the war. Anne dreamed of becoming a famous writer, and she seized her chance. Between May and August of 1944, she rewrote over 300 pages of her diary. It was this edited version that most of us read, without missing what Anne had left out, namely, her pleasure in her changing body with its, quote, sweet secrets, her closeness with her mother and sister, quote, Mummy Margot and I are thick as thieves again, and her awareness that the stories adults tell children about purity and marriage are, quote, nothing more than eyewash. In correcting her diary, Anne knew what she was doing. She wanted her diary to be chosen. It's very interesting to me that we all know the parts about her anger at her mother and her separation from her mother. What she leaves out is her pleasure in the relationship, her closeness. The brilliance of dissociation as a response to trauma is that what is dissociated, split off from consciousness, held out of awareness, is not lost. As the poet Eben Bolin writes, what we lost is here in this room on this veiled evening. Association, the stream of consciousness and the touch of relationship can unlock dissociation, bringing what is out of awareness back into consciousness. When this happens, we have the sensation of coming upon something we know that is something at once familiar and surprising, something we know and yet didn't know that we know. This was my experience in the research with girls. The voices of pre-adolescent girls struck me as at once familiar and surprising. It was my experience as the mother of boys in reading Judy Chu's account of her work with young boys. We know these voices, and yet we discount them. In When Boys Become Boys, Judy Chu reports the study of 4- and 5-year-old boys that she and I started when she was a graduate student at Harvard. Chu followed the boys as they moved from pre-kindergarten through kindergarten and into first grade, and during that time, she witnessed them becoming, quote, boys. That is, she saw the 4- and 5-year-olds who had been so attentive, so direct, so articulate and authentic in their relationships with one another and with her, gradually becoming more inattentive, more indirect, more inarticulate, and inauthentic with one another and with her. They were becoming, quote, boys, or how boys are often said to be. Bringing the eye of a naturalist to her research, Chu shows us how astutely these young boys read both the initiation and also their strategies of resistance. She directs our eyes to their strategic concealment of their empathy and their desire for closeness as they desire to become one of the boys. Boys' relational capacities are not lost, she writes, quote, rather, boys' socialization into cultural constructions of masculinity that are defined in opposition to femininity seems mainly to force a split between what boys know, e.g. about themselves, their relationships, and their world, and what boys show. Winning the boys' trust, Chu learns about the mean team, a club created by the boys, and for the stated purpose of acting against the girls. The mean team established a masculinity defined in opposition to and as the opposite of a femininity associated with being good and nice. Thus, the main activity of the mean team, in the words of one of the boys, was, quote, to bother people. Chu notes that the very relational capacities that boys learn to shield, their empathy and their emotional sensitivity, their vulnerability and their tenderness, are essential if they are to realize the closeness they now seek with other boys. And yet, ironically, by blunting or concealing these capacities in themselves in order to be one of the boys, they render that closeness, the closeness they desire, unattainable. In the epilogue to his book, 13 Ways of Looking at a Man, the psychoanalyst Donald Moss recalls his experience in first grade. Every week, he writes, the children learned a new song, and they were told that at the end of the year, they would each have a chance to lead the class in singing their favorite, which they were to keep a secret. For Moss, the choice was clear. Quote, the only song I loved was the lullaby, When at Night I Go to Sleep, 14 Angels Watch to Keep, from Hansel and Gretel. Every night he would sing it, and like the song said, the angels came, saving him from his night terrors and enabling him to fall asleep. It was, Moss writes, quote, and would always be the most beautiful song I had ever heard. The first graders had learned the song in early autumn, and in late spring, when Moss's turn came, he stood in front of the class. The teacher asked what song he had chosen. Moss recalls, quote, I began to tell her it was the lullaby, but immediately, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the reaction of the boys sitting in the front row. Their faces were lighting up in shock. I knew in a way that was immediate, clear and certain, that what I was about to do, the song I was about to choose, the declaration I was about to make represented an enormous, irrevocable error. What the boys were teaching me was that I was to know now and to always have known that when at night I go to sleep could not be my favorite song, that a lullaby had no place here, that something else was called for. In a flash, in an act of gratitude, not to my angels, but to my boys, I changed my selection. I smiled at the teacher, told her I was just kidding, told her I would now lead the class in singing the Marines hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Moss thus remembers the initiation Chu observed. The Marines hymn could well be the song of the mean team, formed by the boys she studied. As Moss recalls, quote, there were no words. The boys, the eyes of the boys took over to show me that I had needed this lesson. Writing from the vantage point of middle age, himself now the father of sons, Moss says that his book, quote, can be thought of as an extended effort to unpack that moment in front of the class and indirectly to apologize to the angels for my treachery. He had been, quote, unfaithful to them, had, quote, renounced them in public and continued to do so for many years. The residue was a melancholia tied to the boy's awareness that, quote, what he is, quote, really doing in that fateful turning outward is simultaneously preserving and betraying his original love of angels, affirming and denying his new love of boys. After all, now he and the boys are joined together in looking elsewhere for the angels they might have all once had. What Moss shows us with stunning precision is how initiation leads to a rewriting of history. Quote, I was to know now and to always have known that a lullaby could not be my favorite song. And yet he also reminds us that within ourselves, we know what we once knew and then came not to know. The lullaby, quote, was and would always be the most beautiful song I had ever heard. Conclusion. It's treacherous in this postmodern age to speak of an honest voice. Our awareness of cultural differences complicates the quest for moral truth. And yet, as the Laguna Pueblo poet and scholar Paula Gunn Allen writes, quote, "The root of oppression is the loss of memory." I have revealed empathy and then shown how we come to betray it, not in extreme circumstances, but in what passes for ordinary life. And yet for the children in my studies, it was extraordinary to find themselves at a place where they were forced to choose between having a voice and having relationships, or to cover their luminosity, their tenderness, their knowing, their love, their humanity. I've told multiple stories in part to show something that has been brought home to me repeatedly by the students here in Abu Dhabi. The tensions between cultures play out within cultures and also within ourselves. To paraphrase John Berger, quote, "Never again will a single voice be heard as though it's the only one." If we are serious about becoming a global society, then we have to recognize differences not as a barrier to, but as integral to relationships. We each have a voice. None of us is the same. If we're serious now, and given the state of the world, it seems urgent, about bringing our voices into relationship so that collectively we can address the global challenges we face, then we need to hear and encourage the full range of voices within and around us. We need to become a society of listeners. Active listening means asking, how might I invite or call forth a voice that is held in silence, a voice under political or religious or psychological constraint? The research I've summarized for you this evening prompts us to ask, how, when listening to women, can I listen for the honest and perceptive voice of the 10 or 11-year-old girl? What might invite this voice to come forward? And in men, where is the emotionally open and intelligent voice of the 4 or 5-year-old boy? The boy who asks his mother, "Mama, why do you smile when you're sad?" Or the boy who, when his father expresses his remorse for having lost it and hit him the previous day, responds by saying to his father, quote, "You are afraid that if you hit me when I grow up, I'll hit my children," thus giving voice to his father's fear that the cycle he had vowed to break because he had been hit by his father would now continue into the next generation. The question I leave you with, my question, is, knowing what we know about empathy and betrayal, about moral trauma and our capacity to care, how can we join with one another to avoid collectively running off a cliff? Although we live in an age where we look to technology for solutions, I suggest that the answer here lies within ourselves. So, here's what I tell my students. Notice what happens when you replace judgment with curiosity. And as one of them noted in his midterm paper, it's the first step on the road to not betraying empathy. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you for your interesting talk. I had two questions for you. One is about decision making, and one is about you were referring to girls' silence. So the first one on decision making is, it seemed like from the conversation that it was just purely mind or emotions that led to decision making. I don't know if I got that right from you, but I was wondering if religion or culture or peer pressure also influence decision making, and as well as the situation itself that drives either the mind or the emotions. So that's my first question. My second question is on girls' silence. Could it also be due to cultural or family reasons, as well as not just for relationships? So girls keep silent, you were saying, because they want to have, they don't feel their full voice because they want to keep relationships. But I was wondering if it was also due to cultural reasons or social pressures or family pressures. Thank you.
Let me start with your second question. I just want to say I have a great respect for people's silences. I mean, I think people are silent for good reasons. And I think that, it's actually interesting to me because the very first beginning of my research started with my awareness of a silence on the part of men. It's sort of a diversion if I actually go into it, but in a sense I became very interested in what men were not saying, and also in women's experience of speaking and then finding a lack of resonance, that what they said wasn't being understood or was being misheard or misinterpreted, which led them to become silent. So I'm always I'm very interested in the silences. I mean, part of my approach to research is to pay a lot of attention to the gaps or where people don't speak. And as I said, I always think it's for good reason, and you mentioned a lot of the good reasons that people don't speak. But the problem is that if you can't give voice to your own experience, I mean, then basically others don't know what you're experiencing. So in an ironic way, and it's interesting, it's ironic because it's so often in the name of goodness or morality, that we think it's better to be absent than present in relationships. And of course, if you're absent in relationships, then you can't address problems in relationships. So the problems either go unaddressed or they get resolved by other means, such as the use of force. So that's basically what I'm talking about. And of course, you're right, peer pressure affects everybody. We live in a culture, religion is part of the culture. We, like fish, we live in an ocean. And the thing I'm trying to highlight here is very often, it's only when we move out of our own culture, which is, I think, one of the huge advantages of being at a university like NYU Abu Dhabi, that we become aware of what we're not seeing. What was surprising to me in my research was how much children saw. I mean, we don't usually think that children reflect on this. So I brought you the voices of very articulate children who actually described their experience of what psychologists call development, but what the children really experienced as an initiation into ways of seeing and speaking that were, in fact, culturally sanctioned, socially enforced, very rewarded, including, I mean, if we had lots of time, I would tell you, including in the academy. And what gets silenced often is, I mean, if you've taught long enough, you begin to recognize it, is the original insight, the brilliant perception, the one that disrupts and challenges the framework. So we work with that as teachers.
That, I don't know, the men in the audience, whether they would agree with me, but whether we have this inborn thing of art of dissociation, I may call it, as compared to the gender.
As compared to what?
The female gender. Possibly it's easier to dissociate ourselves with emotions more easily than women. That's one. The second thing is about the panel which you said, the panel on the right, the panel in the middle. Maybe at a particular age, I feel boys with boys, when you share your secrets, they keep it better as compared to when at the same age the female shares the secrets with the other female. Maybe it gets out more easily into the rest of the crowd. That's one. The second thing is, after a particular age, I feel, depending on how you are brought up, you tend to share the secret with the other gender better, and they keep it more secretive. So a boy after a particular age would want to share a secret with a female, and she would keep it better, and vice versa. I don't know what's your view on this.
Let me start with where you started, which is, I mean, do men dissociate more than women? Actually, what I showed in my panel, what's interesting to me, the initiation forces dissociation in everyone. I mean, men, it imposes a masculinity which implies, oh, you know, PJ talked about it at the beginning, being rational, unemotional, being separate, not needing relationships, is what those boys talked about. For women, it implies exactly what the other questioner talked about, which is that, you know, becoming selfless, seemingly without a voice or desires of one's own. So all I want to do is really, you know, I used to, when I was interviewing women about moral conflicts, and I kept hearing this, you know, selfish, selfless, women, you should be selfless as a woman, and I started asking women, if it's good to be empathic and responsive with people, you're a person. Why is it selfish to respond to yourself? And woman after woman said to me, this was in the 70s, at the height of the women's movement, good question. So it's not that men dissociate and women don't. Everyone is, if you split human qualities into masculine and feminine, then everyone dissociates from part of themselves. The interesting thing about the women is the initiation occurs later for girls. I mean, just think about it. I mean, you can tell me what it's like in the Emirates, but I can tell you in America. Up until adolescence, a girl can come to school, she can wear pants, it doesn't matter, she can do, you know. If a boy comes to school in a dress, I mean, you know, or like a girl, that's really upsetting. So it starts with boys, and because it happens later for girls, they're more able to observe and describe it, and their resistance is more articulate, whereas I think the resistance of boys is expressed more in action than in words. And I think you're right. I think as adults, we all look for that love relationship. I mean, whether it's with somebody of the same sex or another, I don't think that's the issue. Someone who can be trusted, who we can tell our secrets to. But that person is also supposed to never reveal publicly that they know it, so that there's a kind of collusion in preserving what basically are false images. And I highlighted for you really the absurdity of the gender stereotypes, and what astonishes me is that we repeat them. I mean, we all know that men feel, we all know that women think. We all know that women want justice, care about justice, and want rights. And we know that men care about relationships. So can we start to talk as if we know what we know, is what I'm asking.
I really appreciate some of the things that you're saying. It requires a certain element of bravery. I would say that.
Thank you.
Two things that really resonated with me. I respect people's silences, and to replace judgment with curiosity resonated deeply with me. Many times differences are viewed as deficits, whether they are religious, racial, ideological differences, they are often seen as deficits. When differences are viewed as deficits, people are categorized as either worthy or unworthy victims. So how can empathy exist when differences are seen as deficits?
Well, it's a perfect question to end with, because you take me back to the beginning of my work. I mean, that was the point of In a Different Voice, was that there was no way within these scales to recognize difference without saying then better or worse. And the minute you do that, I mean, you, as you said, I mean, basically you queer empathy. I I mean, it becomes slightly condescending or whatever. And instead of being, I mean, what you're doing is you're judging, instead of really asking, how did this person come to see this differently from the way in which I saw it? So that really took me back to the beginning of my work. And you know, really to a very radical challenge of not only the theories, but also the methods of research that kept slotting human experience into these kinds of categories and comparisons. And I'll end by saying what I said at the start. I feel it's a very, I mean, this global university, NYU Abu Dhabi, is a, you know, deeply, deeply hopeful endeavor. Really an experiment to bring together people from vastly different cultures, religions, countries, so forth. You know, to ask, can we find a way, I mean, to live together, to talk together, because we are right now faced with global challenges, and if we can't do this, it's hard to see how we're going to survive as a species. I mean, that's basically where we are. What's encouraging, I think, is that in the past years, in the years since I wrote In a Different Voice, the human sciences, you know, in a sense, have come forward with a series of findings that make it very clear that what I identified as a different voice, that is a voice that, you know, spoke from a premise that we are interdependent, that we live in relationship with one another, and that we we live in connection with one another. It turns out that our nervous systems are wired to connect thought and emotion, that our evolutionary history, that empathy is part of our evolutionary history. It was key to our survival as a species. So that says that within ourselves, we have the capacities, the requisites, if you put it this way, both for love and for, you know, in a sense, living together democratically, in the sense of being able to work out in relationships our conflicts with one another. So I find this very hopeful, and it's been an extraordinary experience for me to teach here this term. So thank you again for coming, for listening.